particular this collusion that interests us because we've been pitted a narrative where US interests and Chinese interests in particular are at odds with one another and buttressed against one another. But perhaps the tendrils of deceit in that narrative are visible through the evident emulation of Chinese policy, for example, around COVID. So can you give us clear examples of collusion between the CCP and Western interests, be they governmental or private, in particular US pharmacological interests?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the focus of my work is really just on the significance of everything we've experienced over the last 3 years with regard to COVID. If you think back to spring 2020, with those initial lockdowns, what really happened is across the world, liberal democracy suddenly ground to a sudden stop. You know, beginning in Italy and then going from one country to another, you had that domino effect across Europe. And then, you know, quickly came across here to the United States, starting in California, and then state after state implements these draconian lockdowns based on absolutely nothing other than what China says they did in Wuhan for a couple months at the very beginning. And, you know, to your point, I don't think there's any stronger evidence of collusion between these governments than that. I mean, that's really what piqued my interest in this entire subject matter, because this policy of lockdown was not in any Western pandemic plan. It had no history in Western science since the Middle Ages at the very latest. It had been completely, you know, contradicted by everything we learned about infectious disease and epidemiology throughout the 19th and 20th century. This idea of just locking down and arbitrary closing things to try to protect people from ubiquitous respiratory virus had been just completely ruled out by our entire development of our epistemology about infectious disease throughout the last 2 centuries. And yet suddenly, just based on what China says they did, this policy is imported all over the world universally based on absolutely nothing but this vague promise is going to save lives. I think that really speaks to the level of influence that the Chinese Communist Party actually has throughout the Western world. Because even as we're being told that China has experiences backslide into totalitarianism, it becomes this brutal dictatorship, as our officials pretend to be so hawkish and so wary of China. We get all these headlines. When it actually comes to the important policies, you know, they're very credulous about taking this information from China. Every single one of these policies, beginning with the initial lockdowns and then going to, you know, the ventilators, mask mandates, the idea of mass testing, and then of course going all the way to vaccine passes, every single one of these policies really just based on what China says they did in Wuhan.
So you believe that the emulation of the policies in themselves is evidence of a type of collusion, but wouldn't the lockdown measures, which you say there's never been a Western plan for, the fact that that's unprecedented, isn't it because it's an unprecedented situation, Michael, that there's never before been a comparable pandemic? Or are you saying that the Spanish flu was comparable, or even bird flu, or some of the SARS situations that we'd previously had a couple of decades before?
So it's the impression of an unprecedented situation based on all the information that we initially got from China. And that's really what it all comes back to, is the level of credulousness. The problem here is the level of credulousness that our own leaders and our own elites across institutions, across media, academic, journalistic, and political institutions have shown with regard to the information that's come from China. Because the entire impression of this super virus was deliberately sown, I would say deliberately, but sown by the impression that we got of the initial events in Wuhan. You know, suddenly, beginning in January of 2020, we're told that there's this virus, you know, plaguing the residents of Wuhan, and you have all these videos. If you're on social media at that time, you have all these videos of poor Wuhan residents, you know, suddenly spasming and falling into their deaths, and you have piles of bodies in the streets of Wuhan from this super virus is plaguing the residents of Wuhan. And of course, in hindsight, we know all these videos are fake. Every single one of these videos that was going across social media was fake, but that's a very creepy scene to you know, create the world's first impression of this virus. And it sows that seed in people's minds that, you know, oh, could this be real? Could it be that there's this super virus that, you know, necessitates doctors, you know, shooting people as they're trying to escape the city? that's a very creepy thing for ordinary social media user. You know, Facebook is usually such a happy place, but at the beginning of 2020, you're just inundated with these very personal messages that there's a super virus coming to get you. And that creates a very strong initial impression. You couple that with the initial data that came out of China, you know, showing that the fatality rate was, you know, 4%. Of course, we know that's, you know, completely wrong in hindsight. The fatality rate for those under 70 years of age was never higher than 0.1%. The overall infection fatality rate across all age groups was about 0.2%. The initial data from China was that it was, you know, 80 times that, a fatality rate of 4%, which is completely out of whack. And you couple that with this propaganda campaign, this agitprop of, you know, residents falling over, and you have this super strict lockdown. And suddenly the dictator of China implements this strict lockdown